Secretary Pritzker, the Commerce Secretary, was going to be here today. She asked me to apologize on her behalf. She had a personal matter that she had to attend to. So now she threw me into the lambs. Then with all of you guys, I have to do that. But I can go rogue and talk about whatever I want now. So I'm going to start by telling you where I was 2 weeks ago, because I've been doing this for 23 or 24 years, and I've never seen something like what I just witnessed in Jordan. I went into the desert of Jordan, and I was taken by Brigadier General Baruch Spiegel, who's an Israeli general, and he introduced me to a Jordanian general. And these guys were guys who had fought for years and who are now partners for economic cooperation. And Baruch had told me about this thing a year ago, and I didn't really believe it, even though I've been in the field of economic cooperation. Former settlers of the settlement of Gush Katif were religious, nationalist Jews, Orthodox Jews, very observant, in the fields, partnering with Jordanian Bedouins, Muslims, to make the desert bloom. And they're using Israeli cutting-edge agricultural technology to use drip irrigation and all these other really, really fascinating things I saw. They had these gigantic cabbages about this size, the sweetest cabbages you could imagine, making the desert bloom with very, very effective use of water. These cabbages were insectless. For the Orthodox Jews, they are not allowed to eat any produce where the insects have touched them. Hopefully we don't need that either, but they're religiously required not to do that. And so these guys developed this very innovative technology they have all these greenhouses across this desert which is now blooming with green, and they're totally devoid of any insects, doing that without pesticides, without insecticides, just by the methodologies of how they cover, remove the weeds, and just basically create an environment devoid of insects. And the way they do the germination and also is really, really cool. But it doesn't stop there. They have now the ability to export these products made. They employ 40 Syrian refugees. They employ Jordanian Bedouins and some Egyptian farmers. They have about 200 employees so far. And they export not just to the Israeli market, but they're now exporting to Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates. It's just incredible to see. And one of the questions you're going to be able to answer when my time is up here in the next 15 minutes is, what was this confused Mexican Jewish lawyer doing in the midst of this Jordanian Israeli people trying to make the desert bloom? So first I want to tell you that social entrepreneurship, not just the power of business, but the power of business to think about how to address social ills, is extraordinarily important in our day and age. The challenges that we're going to face as humanity are very, very, very serious. You know, whether it's nuclear proliferation or climate change or resource scarcity, whether it was water scarcity or food scarcity, all the displacements that are happening, extremism and fundamentalism, these things are very, very serious. And in my opinion, one of the best ways to tackle some of these ills is by relying on the power of markets, because markets are scalable and sustainable. And you think about it, back in the 15th century, the greatest influence in our society was in the medieval Europe. It was in the church, right? The church permeated into all of society, citizens' lives. And then in the 16th and 17th centuries, the nation state rose up, and it was the government that was most impactful in people's lives. But as the Industrial Revolution happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, and certainly today in the 20th century, it's a lot about the individual and about the power of the markets. Everywhere we go, we're like, markets really, really impact us very, very much. And the power of the markets, if you're able to harness them and use them for something good, is that they are scalable and that they're sustainable. I also have founded some nonprofit organizations, and I think not everything can be resolved through the markets. But having to go out and raise funds is much less fun than for the thing to run by itself. So wherever possible, when I'm trying to think about innovative ways to tackle a social ill or to resolve a thing, when we're able to do it in a market-oriented way, it's really fun, and it's really great not to be having to fundraise every quarter, and you're able to grow. And it's really neat, because the more that you're having a social impact and an economic impact, if these forces, if these objectives are living side by side, the better it is. Like when I started my company, Peaceworks, about 22 or 23 years ago, the whole concept was to use economics as a force for bringing neighbors together. And the idea 20-some years ago, even before the Israeli-Palestinian peace effort, and even before Israel and Jordan had peace, was to try to have Americans as catalysts to bringing Arabs and Israelis to work together. And the theory is that as people are trading with one another, they're shattering cultural stereotypes, they're discovering each other's humanity, and they're also gaining vested interest in preserving those relationships, because they're making money from these ventures, so they want to continue that. And Peaceworks itself has not scaled enormously. Many of you probably haven't heard about it, certainly not as much as Kind. Peaceworks today sells in an entire year less than Kind sells in 2 or 3 hours. But the concept is powerful, because the ventures that we started with Peaceworks 22 years ago, in spite of all the vicissitudes of the conflict, have continued today. And so Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, Turks, from the original Peaceworks venture, are still trading with one another, have developed bonds and friendships. And in my opinion, what we just saw in Jordan can be, just another much bigger manifestation. In a few minutes, I'll tell you how we hope that it will scale for us to do a lot more. A lot of what underlies the ability to have a business with a social impact is to be able to think with and. And to think with and doesn't just impact how businesses can operate to have a social impact also. It's something that can permeate our entire lives also. It's something that can help us be better at whatever we do. Thinking with and is what enabled Kind, the company, to say, well, why does something has to be tasty or healthy? Why can't we find a way to make it both tasty and healthy, and socially impactful, and economically sustainable, and wholesome, and convenient? And the way the and philosophy works is that you question false paradigms. Yes, there are choices we need to make in life. Not everything you can have your cake and eat it too, right? But sometimes you can find a way where, because we're trying to be efficient as human beings, our brains rely on something called heuristics, where we just generalize sometimes, and that's how we develop stereotypes. And these stereotypes, well, in many times very malicious, make our brains efficient, because they help us aggregate information very efficiently. But the danger in the way that our brains sometimes think about the immediate term, about short term, is that we give up a lot of value, because there may be a solution to tackle a problem that if we only gave it a little bit more thought, we were able to come up with a better solution. So to think with and in everything we do in life, you want to first isolate what's the underlying assumption that's preventing you to achieve goal A and B. What is goal A and B? What are the things that you think you can't actually do in tandem? And, in the case of a Kind product that would be tasty and healthy, or a company that would have a social impact and a business success at the same time. And then once you isolate those two goals that you want to attain, start asking why. Why is it that I cannot do this? Why is it that I'm assuming that I can't achieve both objectives at the same time? Sometimes you will tinker with it and you won't come up with it. Very often, we'll realize that either society has evolved and our assumptions about what a society can tolerate, how things can work, have changed, or certainly technology has evolved enormously. And whether you think about Uber, or whether you think about Airbnb, or whether you think about so many examples in life, or those fascinating cows that we just heard about, it's a lot about using technology to think differently and to try to find a way to apply solutions to problems that we have in the past thought you couldn't combine. So in the case of Kind and Peaceworks, and the common thread in everything I do is trying to build bridges between people. And the reason why I care a lot about these issues is my father was a Holocaust survivor. He was a survivor of the Dachau concentration camp, and he was liberated by American soldiers when he was 15 and a half years old. And when I was a little kid in Mexico, he taught me about what he went through. And a lot of what he shared was not easy for a 9-year-old kid to like listen to. And it definitely marked me, but it also marked me with hope, because in addition to the horrors of what he went through and the stuff that he would describe that he had to endure starting when he was 9 years old and up until he was liberated when he was 15 and a half, he also felt that what had helped him survive was the kindness of others, the kindness of strangers that risked their life to help him. And back when he was 9 years old, the superintendent, who was not a necessarily nice guy, went to my grandfather, and when the paramilitary forces were rounding up the other Jewish families, he told my grandfather, go ahead and leave, before I report you to the paramilitary forces. And this was not a nice person. This was a person that 2 weeks before had told my father, who back then was a 9-year-old kid, I see that you're hungry. Let me show you where there's some food for you to eat. And he walked my dad into the streets, and he showed him a pile of dead bodies. And he said, those are Jews. You can go ahead and take some of that meat and eat it. So this was a 9-year-old kid this was a monster of a human being. But he had seen the humanity in my grandfather, because my grandfather had treated the man with dignity every time and had spared his life because my grandfather had treated him well. And when my father was in Dachau, there was a German soldier that, when people were not watching, threw by my dad's feet a potato, which was what my dad felt had helped him continue. And it was not just the potato that man had given him, risking potentially being disciplined or punished, but also the fact that he had seen the humanity of a 12-year-old, or by then maybe 13-year-old kid that was like almost subhuman, because back then, they weighed nothing. They looked like subhuman people, and he had seen into the humanity of him and let him do it. So for me, what I promised myself was that I was going to, in everything I do, try to build bridges and try to use my life to try to do things that are creative, where you're connecting people with one another. And so that's why Peaceworks came about. That's why Kind came about. Kind's mission is to do the kind thing for your body, your taste buds, and your world. We focus very much on always talking about making products that are helpful with nutritionally rich ingredients, and that are where you don't have to sacrifice taste for that. But kind to the world is also a part of us that's very, very important, about trying to inspire kindness in everything we do, and one little act at a time. And since I see that I'm running out of time, I'll just encourage you to go to kindsnacks.com and learn about kind causes, kind people, and the kind awesome cards we do, and different ways that we do to try to just help the most needy and help to inspire acts of kindness in our daily lives with small acts of kindness, and with big acts of kindness where we're giving out $1 million to help communities in need and a lot of neat projects. But I want to end with where I promised you that you would know by the end of this conversation, which is, why the hell was I in Jordan? So besides Peaceworks, Kind now buys more than or about 1% of the world's almonds. And there's a big problem, because as I told you about these challenges we're facing, these challenges are real. The drought in California is hurting Central Valley so much. 86% of the world's almonds are grown in the Central Valley of California, which is suffering enormous droughts, and the trees there are drying, and a lot of them are developing saltiness, and their roots are being hurt. And as people discover all the benefits of almonds, the demand from them is outstripping the supply. And one of the challenges is that growing almonds is very, very tricky. They require a Mediterranean climate. So they've gone from California to Texas, to Virginia, to other places to try to grow almonds, and they have not succeeded, because it's a very, very special type of climate that is required for almonds to grow well. But you know where else they do have a Mediterranean climate? In the Mediterranean. So we had this genius idea to go back to where it was. And now we're looking in Palestine, in Israel. We're going to maybe start looking in other areas in Turkey, maybe in Syria. And certainly our flagship thing that we're looking at in Jordan is looking into not just investing in this really, really cool project, which is so far self-sustaining and profitable. So it's not like we're necessarily going to need to do this out of a charitable cause. We're going to invest in them for them to sustainably be able to grow what they're doing. And as long as the water is enough, because that's still, the scarce resource, but apparently there is enough innovation in the way they do drip irrigation and recycling of the water that they seem to be assuring us in the Jordanian government that they can scale this significantly. But our hope is that we're going to now start out planting almond trees in Jordan, where Israelis and Jordanians, time's up, when Israelis and Jordanians are working together to try to make the desert bloom. They're employing Syrian refugees, which is very, very important, because otherwise there's over 1 million refugees in Jordan that otherwise, if they're not employed, could be much more susceptible to extremist ideologies and preaching. And so that's the power of thinking with Anne. That's the power of using entrepreneurship to try to make a small contribution towards making this a better world. So thank you very much.